Hello everyone. Before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the whispers of the unknown guide you through the eerie corridors of our story. Ready to face the darkness? The Ravenwood Lodge emerged from the mist like a phantom, its dark wooden beams sagging under the weight of time and secrets. James leaned against the steering wheel of his car, gazing at the lodge's silhouette in the dim evening light. The road that had led him here had been long and winding, stretching across desolate stretches of forest, where the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a lone owl. He was tired, his shoulders stiff from hours of driving, and his stomach growled in protest. This lodge, though far from inviting, was his only option for the night. As James stepped out of his car, the chill in the air nipped at his skin, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he approached the building. The sign above the entrance, hanging by a single rusted chain, creaked in the breeze. It read Ravenwood Lodge in faded letters that once might have been gold. A weak, flickering porch light cast eerie shadows across the uneven planks of the front deck. Pushing open the heavy oak door, James was greeted by a bell's metallic chime, announcing his arrival to the otherwise silent lodge. The interior was dimly lit, with a faint scent of aged wood and something more pungent, like damp earth. A small reception desk stood against one wall, cluttered with old ledgers and a dusty telephone. Behind it, a man, the presumed owner, rose slowly from a worn leather chair. The man's appearance was unsettling. He was in his late 50s, with a face lined by years of wear and a sharpness in his pale blue eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim light. His right leg dragged slightly as he moved, his limp accompanied by the dull thud of his cane against the floorboards. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and gravelly. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his tone devoid of warmth. James hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, just for the night. I've been driving all day." The man's eyes scanned James, as if measuring him up. Without another word, he reached beneath the desk and retrieved a brass key attached to a worn leather tag. The number 3 was etched faintly into the metal. "Rooms upstairs. End of the hall," he said, sliding the key across the desk. "But listen," he paused, his gaze sharpening. "Stay out of the cellar. It's locked for a reason." James frowned, caught off guard by the stern warning. "The cellar?" he asked. "Why would you even mention it?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just don't go down there," he said curtly before turning away and disappearing into a back room. The conversation left James with a gnawing curiosity, but fatigue won over, and he decided not to dwell on it. The staircase groaned under his weight as James ascended to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its glow faint and yellowed. The floorboards beneath the threadbare carpet creaked with each step, and the air carried a faint chill. At the end of the hall, room 3 waited for him. The door's paint was chipped, and the brass doorknob felt cold as he turned it. Inside, the room was sparse and unremarkable. A single bed with a faded quilt sat against one wall, accompanied by a small wooden nightstand and a rickety chair. The only decoration was a framed painting of the lodge itself, its dark silhouette looming under a stormy sky. James dropped his duffel bag onto the bed and sighed deeply. It wasn't much, but it would do for the night. He unpacked a few essentials, washed up in the tiny adjoining bathroom, and changed into more comfortable clothes. His stomach growled again, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since lunch. Remembering the lodge's faintly glowing dining room sign he had passed in the hallway, he decided to head downstairs for a meal. The dining area was dimly lit, much like the rest of the lodge. A few round tables were scattered across the room, each covered with a faded cloth. The air smelled of stale coffee and something fried. Behind the counter, a woman, presumably the cook, emerged, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She was middle-aged, with weary eyes and a tight bun that barely contained her graying hair. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice flat but not unfriendly. "Anything warm," James replied with a faint smile. She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. James sat at a table near the corner, his gaze wandering over the room. His eyes fell on a door at the far end, partially obscured by shadows. Unlike the others, this door was reinforced with metal bands and a heavy padlock. It had to be the cellar entrance. James' mind wandered back to the lodgekeeper's warning, and he felt an inexplicable pull toward the locked door. The sound of a plate being set on the table jolted him from his thoughts. The cook had returned with a steaming bowl of stew and a hunk of bread. James thanked her and began eating, savoring the warmth of the meal. Yet, his gaze kept drifting back to that door. He noticed the cook's eyes flick toward it, her expression briefly darkening before she returned to the kitchen. As the hours crept by, James found himself restless. The bed was comfortable enough, but sleep eluded him. The lodge was eerily silent, save for the occasional groan of the old building settling. Then came the sound of faint, rhythmic tapping, almost like knuckles rapping on wood. It seemed to echo up from the floorboards beneath him. James sat up in bed, straining to hear more clearly. The tapping continued, accompanied by an odd scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. His heart began to race. He remembered the cellar and the lodgekeeper's warning, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He slipped out of bed and grabbed his phone for light. Opening his door quietly, he stepped into the hallway. The faint tapping persisted, growing louder as he approached the staircase. He hesitated for a moment, then began descending, each creak of the steps amplifying his tension. The lobby was dark, the only illumination coming from the pale glow of the porch light filtering through the windows. James approached the cellar door, the source of the noise. The padlock hung loosely, as if it had been tampered with. His breath caught in his throat. He reached out tentatively, his hand brushing against the cold metal. Before he could investigate further, a voice startled him. "I told you to stay away from there." James spun around to see the lodgekeeper standing at the foot of the stairs, his face shrouded in shadow. His tone was icy, and his cane thudded against the floor as he stepped closer. "Go back to your room," the lodgekeeper ordered. James' pulse pounded in his ears as he nodded and retreated upstairs. Back in his room, he locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. What was in the cellar? Why was it locked? And why did the tapping sound so much like a call? The rest of the night passed fitfully, with James dozing off only to wake to faint noises. When morning came, the light streaming through the window offered little comfort. He decided he would leave the lodge as soon as possible, but as he packed his things, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving something unfinished, something waiting just beneath the floorboards. The morning light filtered weakly through the lace curtains of room 3, casting jagged patterns on the wooden floor. James hadn't slept well. His dreams had been fragmented and unsettling. Shadowy figures moving in the periphery, whispers that grew louder whenever he turned his head, and the sound of that insistent tapping echoing through the haze of his subconscious. Sitting on the edge of the bed, James rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the remnants of his restless night. The air in the room felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the faint scent of dampness lingered. His suitcase sat half-packed on the floor, but something kept him from zipping it closed. It wasn't just fatigue or indecision. It was a gnawing feeling of unfinished business. He glanced toward the window, where the lodge's grounds stretched out in muted tones of green and brown. The mist had thinned but still clung to the edges of the forest like a shroud. James sighed and pulled on his jacket, resolving to grab breakfast and then leave this strange place behind. Yet, as he opened the door to the hallway, he felt an inexplicable urge to look toward the cellar door one last time. The lodge was eerily quiet as he descended the stairs. The air seemed thicker than the night before, and the faint creaks of the old building felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. James' boots scuffed against the worn floorboards as he entered the dining area, where a pot of lukewarm coffee and a plate of dry toast awaited him on the counter. The cook was nowhere in sight, and neither was the lodgekeeper. James poured himself a cup of coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to lift his spirits. He ate mechanically, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the doorway that led to the lobby. He could just make out the edge of the cellar door from where he sat. The padlock was back in place, but it hung at an odd angle, as if hastily resecured. The air shifted suddenly, a cold draft brushing past him. James froze, the mug halfway to his lips. It felt like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. He set the mug down and turned his head slowly, scanning the room. There was no one there, but the sensation of being watched prickled the back of his neck. Unable to shake the unease, James decided he'd had enough. He returned to his room, determined to pack up and leave. Yet, as he zipped his suitcase closed, a soft sound reached his ears. At first, he thought it was a building settling again, a faint groan of wooden nails. But then it came again, sharper this time. It was a tapping. He stood motionless, listening intently. The sound was faint but deliberate, like someone knocking on a door from far away. His mind raced, replaying the events of the night before. The cellar, the warnings, the lodgekeeper's icy tone. He should leave. He knew he should leave. But something about that sound pulled at him, stirring an inexplicable curiosity. With a resigned sigh, James grabbed his phone and a small flashlight from his bag. He couldn't explain it, even to himself, but he needed to know what was behind that door. Perhaps it was a simple mechanical issue, a trick of the acoustics in an old building. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. The hallway felt colder as he stepped out of his room. The light bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced unnervingly across the walls. James' footsteps echoed softly as he made his way to the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The lodge seemed to grow darker as he descended, as if the building itself were reacting to his intent. When he reached the lobby, he stopped to listen. The tapping had grown louder, more insistent, and it was undoubtedly coming from the cellar door. James approached it cautiously, the hair on his arm standing on end. The padlock, which had appeared loose earlier, now looked as if it could fall off with the slightest touch. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock. Every instinct told him to turn around, to forget about this and leave. But he couldn't. He had to know. Steeling himself, he grabbed the padlock and gave it a gentle tug. To his surprise, it came free easily, as if it had been left unlocked intentionally. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a steep set of wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up was frigid and damp, carrying with it the faint smell of earth and decay. James' flashlight beam wavered as he aimed it down the stairs, illuminating the rough-hewn walls and the cobwebs that clung to the corners. His heart pounded as he took the first step, though with groaning under his weight. The tapping continued, now echoing faintly from below. It wasn't hurried or frantic. It was steady, methodical, as if whoever, or whatever, was making the sound wanted to be found. James descended slowly, each step feeling like an eternity. The farther he went, the colder the air became, and the stronger the smell of dampness grew. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a small, dimly lit room. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly and casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The floor was dirt, uneven and marked with what appeared to be drag marks leading toward the center of the room. In the middle stood an old wooden table, its surface cluttered with strange, unidentifiable objects. James approached cautiously, his flashlight illuminating the table. There were jars filled with murky liquids, yellowed papers covered in illegible handwriting, and a small, ornate box with intricate carvings that seemed to shift under the light. But it was the object next to the box that caught his attention. A large iron key, heavy and rusted, its design archaic and almost ceremonial. He reached out to pick up the key, but as his fingers brushed against it, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The air felt charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Slowly, he looked around the room, his flashlight beam darting across the walls. Then he saw it. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by shadows, was another door. It was smaller than the cellar door above, but made of the same dark wood, reinforced with metal bands. Unlike the door he had just passed through, this one had no lock. Instead, it bore a symbol carved deep into the wood, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, almost like a sunburst. James felt a chill run down his spine as he approached the door. The symbol seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had come too far to stop now. As he turned the knob, the air grew colder still, and a low hum began to resonate from beyond the door. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in his chest, primal and otherworldly. The door creaked open, revealing a long, narrow corridor carved into the earth. The walls were lined with ancient-looking stone, damp and slick to the touch. The hum grew louder as James stepped inside, the sound almost drowning out his own heartbeat. He moved cautiously, his flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, curving slightly as it went. The farther he walked, the stronger the hum became, until it was almost unbearable. Then, suddenly, it stopped. James froze, his breath visible in the icy air. Ahead of him, the corridor opened into a larger chamber, the edges of which were shrouded in darkness. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and atop it sat an object that made James' blood run cold. It was a black sphere, about the size of a bowling ball, and it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The surface pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. As he approached the pedestal, James felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force drawing him closer. His fingers itched to touch the sphere, but a deep, guttural voice echoed in his mind. "Leave." He stumbled back, the voice reverberating through his skull. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving closer. James turned and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he retraced his steps through the corridor. The hum resumed, louder and more aggressive, almost like a roar. When he reached the cellar stairs, he scrambled up, slamming the door shut behind him. He fumbled with the padlock, securing it in place even though he knew it wouldn't hold whatever was down there. His chest heaved as he collapsed against the door, his mind racing. The lodge was silent again, but James knew he couldn't stay. Whatever was in the cellar, whatever he had disturbed, was not meant to be found. He grabbed his belongings and fled, the tapping sound echoing faintly in his mind as he drove away into the morning light. Yet, even as he left the lodge behind, James couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't escaped. The cold, magnetic pull of the sphere lingered in his thoughts, and the memory of that guttural voice haunted his every waking moment. He had left the cellar, but a part of it had followed him, burrowing deep into his mind and soul. James drove for miles, but the memory of the cellar clung to him like a shadow. The unnerving hum and the pulsing black sphere haunted his thoughts, replaying in vivid detail every time he closed his eyes. Even as the lodge disappeared behind him, the oppressive weight of what he had seen seemed to linger in the air, heavy and suffocating. He turned the radio on to drown out the silence, but the static only reminded him of the sound in the corridor. He switched it off and gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by towering pines that swayed gently in the wind. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy, dappling the asphalt with golden patches, but the beauty of the scenery did little to ease James' unease. Every so often, he glanced in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following him. The sense of being watched hadn't left him since the moment he'd stepped out of the cellar. By midday, James pulled into a small roadside diner. The neon sign above the door buzzed faintly, and a few cars were parked haphazardly in the gravel lot. He needed a break. From the road, from the memories, from the overwhelming sense of dread that refused to let him go. As he entered, the bell above the door jingled, and a few heads turned briefly before returning to their meals. The air inside was thick with the scent of frying bacon and stale coffee, a strange but welcome change from the damp, earthy smell that seemed to cling to his clothes. James slid into a booth near the window, his back to the wall. He scanned the room, taking in the mismatched tables and the tired-looking waitress who shuffled between them with a pot of coffee. An older man sat at the counter, his face hidden behind a newspaper, while a couple in a nearby booth spoke in hushed tones. Everything seemed normal, mundane even, but James couldn't shake the feeling that the lodge had left a mark on him, invisible but profound. The waitress approached with a notepad and a faint smile. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice tinged with the weariness of someone who had worked too many double shifts. "Just coffee. Black," James replied, his voice hoarse. She nodded and disappeared behind the counter. James' gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the pines stood still, their dark silhouettes oddly menacing in the daylight. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of his thoughts. What had he seen in that cellar? The key, the door with the strange symbol, the corridor, and the sphere. The memory of its cold, magnetic pull sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't know what it was, but he was certain it wasn't meant to be found. The waitress returned with a steaming cup of coffee, setting it down with a soft clink. "Anything else?" she asked, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary. James shook his head, and she walked away. He wrapped his hands around the mug, letting its warmth seep into his skin, grounding him. For the first time since leaving the lodge, he allowed himself to breathe, but peace was fleeting. As James sipped his coffee, a strange sensation washed over him. It started as a faint pressure at the base of his skull, growing steadily until it felt like a vice tightening around his head. He set the mug down, his hand trembling. The din of the diner, the clatter of plates, the murmur of conversation, the hum of the coffee machine seemed to fade, replaced by a low, familiar hum. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he swore he saw the black sphere reflected in the polished surface of the table. James blinked hard, shaking his head. When he looked again, the sphere was gone, and the sounds of the diner rushed back in. His breathing was shallow, and his chest felt tight. He glanced around nervously, but no one seemed to have noticed his distress. The waitress was chatting with the couple, and the old man at the counter hadn't moved. James ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady himself. He needed to pull it together. Whatever was happening to him, it couldn't follow him forever, could it? He left a few bills on the table and stepped outside, the crisp air hitting him like a slap. The tension in his head eased slightly, but the sense of unease remained. As he climbed into his car, he noticed something peculiar. There, in the dirt beside the rear tire, was a set of footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the edge of the forest to his car. His stomach churned. He hadn't seen anyone near his car when he arrived. The thought that someone or something had been watching him sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through him. James started the engine and pulled out of the lot, his eyes darting to the rear-view mirror. The diner grew smaller in the distance until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the forest. The road stretched on, empty and quiet, but James couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every so often, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks, a flicker of motion just at the edge of his vision. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, but his grip on the wheel tightened all the same. As the miles ticked by, James' thoughts returned to the lodge. He remembered the lodgekeeper's stern warning, the cryptic words spoken with an edge of fear. "Stay out of the cellar. It's locked for a reason." James had ignored the warning, driven by curiosity, and now he was paying the price. But what was the price? Was it this lingering sense of dread, or something more tangible, more dangerous? The hum returned that night, as James checked into a roadside motel. It was faint at first, barely audible over the drone of the air conditioner, but it grew louder as the hours passed. Lying in the dimly lit room, James stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The hum seemed to resonate in his chest, vibrating through his very being. He sat up abruptly, his breath coming in short gasps. He couldn't stay here. He needed answers. Grabbing his phone, James searched for any information about the Ravenwood Lodge. The results were sparse. A few reviews mentioning its remote location, its outdated decor, and its quirky owner. But one post stood out. It was from a forum dedicated to paranormal experiences dated several years back. The poster described staying at the lodge and hearing strange noises at night. They mentioned the cellar, describing it as a place no guest should ever enter. The post ended abruptly with the words, "I left before I could find out more." Something was watching me. James' heart pounded as he read and reread the post. It was vague, but it confirmed his suspicions. There was something wrong with that cellar, something unnatural. He scrolled further, finding references to old legends about the area, stories of disappearances, strange lights in the forest, and whispered tales of a dark heart hidden beneath the ground. The pieces didn't quite fit, but they painted a picture of a place steeped in mystery and fear. The next morning, James made a decision. He couldn't ignore what he had experienced. The sphere, the symbol, the hum. They were all connected, and he needed to know how. Against his better judgment, he turned his car around and began the long drive back to Ravenwood Lodge. The road felt different this time, darker and more foreboding. The pines loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The mist thickened as he neared the lodge, wrapping around the car and obscuring the road ahead. By the time he reached the gravel lot, the sun had disappeared behind heavy clouds, casting the lodge in a dim, gray light. James stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots unnervingly loud in the silence. The lodge stood unchanged, its dark facade as foreboding as ever. But this time, James wasn't here for a place to rest. He was here for answers. And this time, he wasn't leaving until he found them. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the bell above it chiming faintly. The lobby was empty, the reception desk abandoned. James hesitated, then called out, "Hello." His voice echoed, but there was no response. The lodge felt different, colder and darker, as if it had been waiting for him. James' gaze drifted to the cellar door. The padlock was gone. James' heart raced as his eyes locked onto the cellar door. The padlock, which had previously barred entry, was gone. The absence of the lock was unnerving, as if an unseen force had anticipated his return and removed the barrier. He approached the door cautiously, his breath shallow and deliberate. The wood bore deep scratches, marks that hadn't been there before. They were erratic, as though something had clawed at the door in desperation. The lodge was eerily silent, amplifying the creak of the floorboards beneath James' feet. His hand hovered over the doorknob. For a moment, he considered turning back. Whatever answers he sought, they might come at a price he wasn't prepared to pay. But the pull of the unknown was too strong. With a deep breath, he turned the knob, the metal icy against his skin. The door swung open, revealing the steep staircase leading into darkness. The faint smell of damp earth and rot wafted up, more pungent than before. James aimed his flashlight into the void, its beam cutting through the gloom to illuminate the rough-hewn walls of the cellar. The air was colder than he remembered, and the hairs on his arms stood on end as he descended. The faint hum he'd heard in his motel room returned, growing louder with each step. It resonated in his chest, a low vibration that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. The sound was otherworldly, neither mechanical nor natural, and it filled him with a sense of foreboding. James' grip on the flashlight tightened as he reached the bottom of the stairs. The cellar appeared unchanged, yet there was a palpable tension in the air. The wooden table still stood at the center of the room, its surface cluttered with the strange artifacts he had seen before.
The jars, papers, and ornate box were undisturbed, but the iron key was gone. James' stomach churned. Someone had been here since his last visit. His flashlight swept across the room, landing on the second door at the far end. The symbol carved into the wood glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with a hum. The sight sent a shiver down James' spine. He approached the door, drawn to it despite the sense of dread that gripped him. The symbol's intricate design seemed alive, the jagged lines shifting ever so slightly as he drew closer. The doorknob was warm to the touch, a stark contrast to the icy air around him. James hesitated, his mind racing with questions. What lay beyond this door? Was it connected to the black sphere he had seen in the corridor? And why did he feel as though opening it would change him forever? He turned the knob, and the door creaked open to reveal the narrow corridor he had seen before. The walls glistened with moisture, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the confined space. James stepped inside, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The corridor curved slightly, and his flashlight illuminated the slick surface ahead. As he moved deeper into the passage, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost oppressive. The hum shifted in tone, rising and falling like a chant in an unrecognizable language. James' breathing quickened, and he fought the urge to turn back. Every step felt like a descent into something ancient and malevolent. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, much like before, but the layout had changed. The pedestal that had once held the black sphere was gone, replaced by a deep pit in the center of the room. The edges of the pit were lined with runes etched into the stone, glowing faintly in the dim light. The hum seemed to emanate from the pit itself, the vibration stronger than ever. James approached cautiously, his flashlight beam flickering as if resisting his movements. Peering into the pit, he saw nothing but darkness, an abyss that seemed to stretch infinitely downward. The edges of the runes pulsated, casting an eerie light onto his face. He felt a pull, stronger than anything he had experienced before, urging him to step closer. A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against stone. James spun around, his flashlight scanning the chamber. The shadows seemed to shift and coalesce, forming shapes that melted away as quickly as they appeared. His heart pounded, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The echo of his words seemed to linger unnaturally, twisting into faint whispers that surrounded him. He backed away from the pit, his flashlight darting frantically across the room. Then he saw it, at the far end of the chamber, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its form shrouded in tattered black robes. Its face was obscured, but two glowing orbs, red and unblinking, peered out from the darkness. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its presence filling the room with a suffocating sense of dread. James stumbled backward, his legs trembling. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, drowning out his thoughts. The figure raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at him. James felt a pressure in his chest, as if invisible hands were gripping his lungs. He gasped for air, his vision blurring. Summoning every ounce of strength, James turned and ran. The corridor seemed longer than before, the exit impossibly far away. The hum chased him, now accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried. The walls closed in, and James' flashlight flickered wildly, casting disorienting shadows. He reached the door and slammed it shut behind him, leaning against it as he struggled to catch his breath. The cellar was silent once more, but the sense of foreboding remained. James locked the door with a trembling hand and backed away, his mind racing. Whatever he had seen in the chamber, it wasn't human. It wasn't meant to be disturbed. James ascended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he emerged into the lobby, the lodge felt different. The air was thick, and the walls seemed to lean inward, as if the building itself were alive and aware of his trespass. He grabbed his bag from his room and headed for the door, determined to leave this place behind for good. As he stepped outside, The afternoon sun seemed blinding after the oppressive darkness of the cellar. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, and the lodge loomed behind him like a sentinel. He climbed into his car, his hands shaking as he started the engine. The sound of the motor was a welcome relief. Grounding him in reality, James drove away, but the hum stayed with him. It was faint now, a distant echo in the back of his mind, but it was there. The figure's glowing eyes haunted his thoughts, and the memory of the pit filled him with an unshakable dread. He didn't know what he had unleashed, but he was certain it wasn't over. The road stretched on, winding through the forest that seemed darker than before. James glanced in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the distance. The lodge had receded from view, but its presence lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on him. As night fell, James pulled into a motel, unable to continue driving. The room was small and unremarkable, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the lodge. He double-checked the locks on the door and windows, his paranoia mounting with each passing minute. Lying in bed, James stared at the ceiling, the hum resonating faintly in his ears. Sleep eluded him, his mind replaying the events of the day in relentless detail. The glowing runes, the abyssal pit, and the red-eyed figure. Each memory felt like a piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. In the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally overtook him. His dreams were chaotic and vivid, filled with shifting shadows and whispers that seemed to beckon him back to the cellar. When he woke, the first rays of dawn filtering through the curtains, he felt no relief. The hum was louder now, as if it were coming from within him. James knew he couldn't escape. Whatever he had encountered in the cellar had marked him, and it wouldn't rest until he returned. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his face pale and drawn. The man staring back at him looked like a stranger, haunted, hollow, and afraid. He had no choice. He had to go back. The lodge, and whatever lay beneath it, was calling him. The drive back to Ravenwood Lodge felt surreal, as though James were caught in a waking dream. The hum had become a constant in his ears, a low vibration that seemed to sync with his pulse. Every mile he drove, the pull grew stronger, as if the lodge itself were drawing him back. The forest on either side of the road seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper and more menacing. The occasional flicker of movement in the trees kept his nerves on edge, but he forced himself to focus on the road ahead. By the time the lodge came into view, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in hues of deep purple and gray. The building stood silhouetted against the twilight, its dark facade as uninviting as ever. James parked his car in the gravel lot, the crunch of tires on stone unnervingly loud in the stillness. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as he tried to steady his breathing. The lodge loomed before him, a monument to everything he didn't understand but couldn't escape. Finally, he stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the entrance. The porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced across the worn wooden planks. James hesitated before opening the door, his hand hovering over the handle. The memory of the red-eyed figure in the chamber filled his mind, but he pushed it aside. He needed answers, and they were waiting for him inside. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the sound echoing in the empty lobby. The air inside was colder than he remembered, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards under his weight. The reception desk was empty, and there was no sign of the lodgekeeper or the cook. It was as though the lodge had been abandoned, left to rot in its own darkness. James' gaze was drawn immediately to the cellar door. The padlock was back in place, but it looked different, newer, shinier, as if it had been replaced since his last visit. He approached it cautiously, his flashlight in hand. The hum grew louder as he neared the door, vibrating through his chest like the bass line of an otherworldly melody. He reached out to touch the padlock, his fingers trembling. Before he could act, a sound from behind startled him. James spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The lobby was empty, but the sound came again, a faint shuffling, like fabric brushing against wood. His heart pounded as he scanned the room, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing eerily. There was no response, only the oppressive silence. James turned back to the cellar door, determined to proceed. He pulled a small multi-tool from his pocket and began working on the padlock. The mechanism was stubborn, but desperation fueled his efforts. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open, and the heavy padlock fell to the floor with a dull thud. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the familiar staircase descending into darkness. The smell of damp earth and decay was stronger this time, almost overpowering. James aimed his flashlight down the stairs, illuminating the rough wooden steps and the stone walls beyond. The hum resonated through the air, louder and more insistent than ever. As he descended, the wall seemed to close in around him, the space feeling tighter and more claustrophobic with each step. His breathing echoed in the confined space, mingling with the hum to create an unsettling harmony. When he reached the bottom, he found himself once again in the small chamber with the wooden table. The artifacts were still there, untouched, but the iron key was nowhere to be found. James' flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on the second door. The symbol carved into its surface glowed faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the hum. He approached it cautiously, his heart pounding. The doorknob was warm to the touch, just as it had been before. Taking a deep breath, James turned the knob and stepped into the corridor beyond. The narrow passage stretched ahead of him, its walls slick with moisture and lined with faintly glowing runes. The hum was deafening now, a relentless drone that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. James moved forward slowly, his flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The corridor twisted and turned, disorienting him as he tried to keep track of his bearings. As he walked, James began to notice something strange. The runes on the wall seemed to shift and change as he passed, their shapes morphing into patterns that were both mesmerizing and unsettling. He couldn't read them, but they seemed to convey a sense of warning, a message meant to deter anyone who ventured this far. Yet, despite their ominous nature, James felt compelled to continue. The corridor eventually opened into a larger chamber, much like the one he had seen before. But this time, the room was filled with an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The pedestal was back, standing at the center of the room, and atop it rested the black sphere. Its surface was as smooth and featureless as before, but it pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow that seemed to sync with the hum. James approached the pedestal, his footsteps hesitant. The pull of the sphere was stronger than ever, an almost magnetic force that drew him closer. As he reached out to touch it, a voice echoed through the chamber. It was deep and guttural, speaking in a language James couldn't understand. The sound filled the room, reverberating off the walls and shaking the very ground beneath his feet. James froze, his hand hovering inches from the sphere. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and he felt a pressure in his chest, as though something were squeezing the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, and the voice ceased abruptly, leaving only the hum in its wake. The shadows in the chamber began to shift, coalescing into shapes that moved with unnatural fluidity. James' flashlight flickered as he scanned the room, his panic mounting. The shapes grew more defined, taking on humanoid forms with glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. They moved toward him slowly, their movements deliberate and menacing. James turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the corridor as the shadows pursued him. The runes on the walls flared brightly as he passed, their light momentarily disorienting him. The hum grew louder, drowning out the sound of his own breathing and the pounding of his heart. He reached the door and slammed it shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. The cellar was silent again, but James knew he wasn't safe. He ascended the stairs as quickly as he could, his legs shaking with each step. When he reached the lobby, he found the lodgekeeper standing there, his pale blue eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. "I told you to stay out of the cellar," the lodgekeeper said, his voice low and trembling. "What is that thing?" James demanded, his voice shaking. "What's down there?" The lodgekeeper sighed heavily, leaning on his cane. "You've seen too much," he said. "You should never have come back." Before James could respond, the hum returned, louder than ever. The lodgekeeper's eyes widened, and he turned toward the cellar door. "It's awake," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. "You've woken it." The lights in the lobby flickered, and the temperature dropped sharply. James felt a chill run down his spine as the lodgekeeper stepped toward the door, his expression grim. "If you want to survive, you need to leave. Now." James hesitated, torn between fear and the need for answers. But the lodgekeeper's tone left no room for argument. Grabbing his bag, James fled the lodge, the hum following him into the night. James sped away from Ravenwood Lodge, the car's engine roaring against the oppressive silence of the forest road. The hum persisted, faint but insistent, an unwelcome passenger in his mind. The lodgekeeper's cryptic words echoed in his ears. "It's awake. You've woken it." What had he stirred? What ancient, malevolent force had been waiting in the darkness for someone like him to come along and disrupt its slumber? The trees blurred past as he pushed the car faster, the headlights cutting through the thick mist that seemed to grow denser with each passing mile. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as though the act of holding on could anchor him to reality. Yet, the reality he now faced was unlike anything he'd ever known. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a constant, invasive force that refused to be ignored. James glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the glowing red eyes of the shadowy figures from the chamber. The back seat was empty, but the weight of unseen eyes lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed, not by something physical, but by the very essence of whatever he had disturbed. He drove until the forest thinned, and the first signs of civilization appeared. A small gas station emerged from the mist, its flickering neon sign offering a faint promise of respite. James pulled into the lot, the car's tires crunching over gravel. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring at the station. It looked ordinary enough, but after what he'd experienced, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as James stepped inside. A middle-aged clerk stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. He barely glanced up as James entered, but the man's casual demeanor offered a small sense of normalcy. James grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter, his mind still racing. "Rough night?" the clerk asked, noting James' disheveled appearance. James hesitated, unsure how to respond. "You could say that," he muttered, sliding a few bills across the counter. The clerk handed him his change, his expression shifting to one of mild concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." James forced a weak smile. "Something like that." He left the station and leaned against his car, gulping down the water as he tried to collect his thoughts. The hum had quieted slightly, as if retreating into the background, but it was still there, a constant reminder of what he couldn't escape. He stared out at the empty road ahead, knowing that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever he had awakened wasn't bound to the cellar. It was bound to him, back on the road. James tried to focus on a plan, but his thoughts were fragmented, his mind a chaotic swirl of fear and questions. What was the black sphere? Who, or what, was the red-eyed figure? And why had the lodgekeeper allowed him to leave instead of stopping him? The answers felt maddeningly out of reach. But James couldn't shake the sense that he was being led somewhere, drawn by an invisible thread. The hum seemed to grow louder as he approached a crossroads, the vibrations resonating in his chest. Without fully understanding why, he turned left, following an unmarked road that cut through the woods like a scar. The road narrowed, the trees closing in on either side. James slowed the car, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The hum grew stronger, guiding him deeper into the forest until he reached a clearing. At the center stood an old stone chapel, its crumbling facade shrouded in ivy and moss. The structure exuded an aura of abandonment, yet James felt a strange pull toward it, as though it were waiting for him. He stepped out of the car, the night air heavy with the scent of damp earth. The hum was almost deafening now, a relentless force that seemed to emanate from the chapel itself. James approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The wooden door was ajar, revealing a dim interior lit by flickering candles. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Someone had been here recently. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wax and mildew. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, their meanings lost to time. At the center of the room stood an altar, draped in tattered cloth and adorned with strange symbols. Behind it, a statue loomed, its features worn and indistinct. Yet its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, seemed to glow faintly, mirroring the red orbs from the chamber. James' footsteps echoed as he approached the altar. The hum reached a crescendo, vibrating through the very walls of the chapel. On the altar lay an object wrapped in dark cloth. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it, revealing an iron key identical to the one he had seen in the cellar. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through him. This key wasn't just an artifact. It was a piece of the puzzle, a link to whatever dark force he had awakened. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions. James spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. The shadows seemed to move, coalescing into shapes that slithered along the walls. The growl deepened, reverberating through the chapel like a predator's warning. James backed toward the door, clutching the key tightly. The air grew colder, and his breath came out in visible puffs. The shadows moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. Red eyes blinked into existence, staring at him from the darkness. Panic surged through him as he stumbled out of the chapel, slamming the door behind him. The hum followed him as he ran to his car, the key burning cold against his palm. He fumbled with the door handle, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, he threw himself into the driver's seat and started the engine. The tires spun on the gravel before finding traction, and he sped away, the chapel disappearing into the mist behind him. Underscore, 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 underscore. James drove through the night, his mind racing. The key felt heavy in his pocket, a tangible reminder of the danger he was now entangled in. He couldn't go to the authorities. What would he even tell them? That he'd found an ancient key in a haunted lodge and been chased by shadowy figures? They'd think he was insane. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to find them. The lodgekeeper had seemed to know more than he let on, but returning to Ravenwood felt like a death sentence. Yet, as the hours passed and dawn began to break, James realized he had no other choice. The lodge was the epicenter of everything that had happened, and if he wanted to end this, he had to go back. By the time he reached the lodge, the sun was rising, casting an eerie light over the building. It looked different in the daylight, less menacing but no less mysterious. James parked his car and stepped out, the morning air crisp and cold. The hum was quieter now, almost like a whisper, but its presence was still unmistakable. The lodge was silent as he entered, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting him. The reception desk was empty, and the cellar door stood slightly ajar, as though inviting him back. James hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. He knew what awaited him below, but he also knew he couldn't turn back. Descending the stairs, James felt the weight of the key in his pocket. The cellar was unchanged, the artifacts on the table undisturbed. The second door loomed before him, its glowing symbol pulsating faintly. Taking a deep breath, he inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a loud click, and the door creaked open. Beyond the door was a staircase, spiraling downward into the earth. The air was colder here, and the hum grew louder with each step. James descended slowly, his flashlight illuminating the rough stone walls. The staircase seemed endless, winding deeper and deeper until he lost all sense of time and direction. Finally, he emerged into a vast cavern. The ceiling stretched high above, lost in shadows, and the walls were lined with glowing runes. At the center of the cavern stood a massive stone structure, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The black sphere rested atop it, pulsing with a light that seemed to sync with James' heartbeat. As he approached, the sphere began to glow brighter, the hum reaching an almost unbearable pitch. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, and the air grew heavy with the scent of earth and decay. James reached out, his hand trembling. The moment his fingers brushed the sphere, a blinding light filled the cavern, and the hum exploded into a deafening roar. James was thrown backward, landing hard on the stone floor. When he opened his eyes, the cavern was dark and the sphere was gone. The hum had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. As he struggled to his feet, he realized the shadows were no longer moving. They were gone, and the red eyes had disappeared. But the key was still in his pocket, and the weight of what he had unleashed remained. James knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. James stood in the vast, echoing cavern, his breath shallow and unsteady. The blinding light that had erupted from the black sphere moments earlier still lingered in his vision, leaving ghostly afterimages that danced in the shadows around him. The sphere, the object that had drawn him deeper and deeper into this nightmare, was gone, leaving behind an empty pedestal. But the silence that followed its disappearance was not a relief. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the skin, that filled the lungs with dread. The glowing runes along the walls began to dim, their pulsating light fading into the cold, rough stone. The oppressive hum that had accompanied him since the first descent into the cellar was absent now, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to emanate from the cavern floor itself. James felt it through the soles of his boots, an unsettling rhythm that made his legs feel weak. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, James realized that the cavern was far larger than he had initially perceived. The darkness stretched endlessly, swallowing the farthest edges of the space. The runes, now nearly extinguished, marked the perimeter of the chamber like the faint outline of a boundary he instinctively knew not to cross. In the center of it all stood the pedestal, its surface now barren, but still radiating an inexplicable menace. What now? James muttered under his breath, his voice swallowed by the cavern. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had disturbed something ancient and incomprehensible, and that whatever force he had awakened was still present, watching, waiting. A sudden sound broke the silence, a deep, resonant crack that reverberated through the cavern like a gunshot. James froze, his pulse quickening. The sound came again, louder this time, and he realized it was coming from beneath him. The ground shuddered, the vibrations intensifying until they were impossible to ignore. Tiny fragments of stone began to fall from the cavern's ceiling, clattering onto the floor around him. James backed away from the pedestal, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam flickered, the bulb struggling against the oppressive energy that now filled the air. He scanned the cavern, searching for an exit, but the darkness seemed impenetrable. The cracks beneath him grew louder, and with a final, deafening roar, the ground split open. A massive fissure tore through the floor, radiating outward from the pedestal. James stumbled, barely keeping his balance as the ground shifted beneath him. From the depths of the fissure, an otherworldly light began to seep, a cold, pulsating glow that bathed the cavern in an eerie, greenish hue. The light was mesmerizing, yet it filled James with a primal terror that he couldn't suppress. And then, from the depths of the fissure, it emerged. At first, James thought it was a shadow, an extension of the unnatural light. But as it rose, its form became clear. The entity was vast, amorphous, its surface rippling and shifting as though it were made of liquid darkness. It had no discernible face, but its presence was suffocating, its sheer size dwarfing everything else in the cavern. Tendrils of shadow extended from its mass, writhing and curling as though tasting the air. James' flashlight fell from his hand, clattering to the ground as he stumbled backward. His mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing, the sheer impossibility of it defying every rational thought. The entity's tendrils stretched toward him, and though they didn't touch him, he felt their presence as a cold, invasive force that seemed to pierce his very soul. A sound filled the cavern, low and guttural, resonating in a way that James felt more than heard. It wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense, but it carried a message nonetheless. It was ancient, incomprehensible, yet James understood it instinctively. The entity was aware of him. It had been awakened and it knew him. "No!" James whispered, his voice trembling. "No! This isn't happening." The fissure widened and the entity surged forward, its tendrils stretching closer. James turned and ran, his boots slipping on the uneven ground as he sprinted toward the staircase. The cavern seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in as though the space itself were alive, conspiring to trap him. The staircase loomed ahead, a narrow spiral that disappeared into the shadows above. James' lungs burned as he reached it, his hands gripping the cold, rough stone of the railing. He climbed desperately, the sound of the entity's approach filling his ears. It wasn't a sound he could describe, a cacophony of whispers, roars, and unearthly vibrations that made his skull feel like it might split open. As he ascended, the stairs began to crumble behind him. The entity's presence was disintegrating the very structure of the cavern, its tendrils devouring the stone as it pursued him. James climbed faster, his legs screaming in protest, his vision blurring with the effort. The glow of the fissure below grew fainter, but the sense of the entity's presence didn't wane. At last, James burst through the cellar door, slamming it shut behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The lodge was silent, the oppressive hum that had haunted him gone. For a moment, he thought he might be safe, but then the floor beneath him trembled, and he realized the entity wasn't confined to the cavern. It was spreading, its influence seeping into the very foundation of the lodge. James grabbed his bag and fled, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The lodge seemed to twist around him, the corridors stretching and warping as though the building itself were being consumed. The front door appeared ahead, and James barreled through it, stumbling into the cold night air. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he sprinted to his car. He threw himself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys as his hands shook uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning before finding traction. The lodge receded in the rear-view mirror, its dark silhouette collapsing in on itself as though being swallowed by the earth. But even as he sped down the forest road, James knew he wasn't free. The entity's presence lingered, a weight in his chest, a shadow at the edges of his vision. The fissure had opened, and whatever had been contained within it was no longer bound. The thought filled him with a dread deeper than anything he had ever known. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the mist swallowing everything beyond the reach of his headlights. James' hands tightened on the steering wheel as he drove, his mind racing. He had escaped the lodge, but he hadn't escaped the entity. It was out there now, free to spread its influence, and he didn't know how to stop it. As dawn broke, painting the horizon in pale hues of orange and pink, James pulled into a rest stop. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, his head resting against the steering wheel. The silence was deafening, the absence of the hum almost as unsettling as its presence had been. He felt hollow, drained, as though a part of him had been left behind in the cavern. Stepping out of the car, James stretched his legs and walked to a nearby bench. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed almost normal. Almost. He sat down, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. The smoke curled upward, disappearing into the cool morning air. He had survived, but at what cost? The entity was free, and he had no idea how to contain it, let alone destroy it. The lodgekeeper's warning echoed in his mind. You've woken it. James had woken something ancient, something that had been meant to remain buried, and now it was loose in the world. The thought was almost too much to bear. As he sat there, staring into the distance, a faint vibration began to build beneath his feet. James froze, his heart pounding as the familiar hum returned. Faint but unmistakable, it was a reminder, a promise, that the entity wasn't finished with him. Not yet. James remained seated on the bench at the rest stop, the cigarette burning down to a stub between his trembling fingers. The hum beneath his feet had grown louder, more insistent, a reminder that the nightmare was far from over. He crushed the cigarette beneath his boot and rose slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting the entity to materialize before him. The morning light offered no comfort. It only revealed the stark reality that he was tethered to something far beyond his understanding. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. With shaking hands, James pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello," he said, his voice hoarse. There was a pause, and then a voice spoke, low, gravelly, and unmistakably familiar. You felt it, haven't you? It was the lodgekeeper. James' grip tightened on the phone. "What is this thing?" he demanded. "What did I wake up?" The lodgekeeper sighed, a sound heavy with regret. "It's older than anything you can comprehend. We called it the Watcher, but that's just a name we gave to something we'll never truly understand. It was bound to that place for a reason, locked away to keep it from spreading. But now..." James felt a surge of anger. "Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you tell me what was down there? Would you have listened?" The lodgekeeper replied, his tone sharp. "People like you never do. Curiosity is a curse. It pulls at the edges of the unknown until something breaks." James was silent, the weight of the lodgekeeper's words settling heavily on him. "How do I stop it?" he asked finally. Another pause, longer this time. "You can't," the lodgekeeper said. "Not alone, but there are others. People who've dealt with things like this before. Find them. They'll know what to do." The line went dead before James could respond. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. Others? Who were they? And how was he supposed to find them? He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The hum beneath his feet, now vibrating through his entire body. Whatever the Watcher was, it wasn't going to wait for him to figure things out. The road stretched out before him, endless and foreboding. James drove aimlessly for hours, the hum growing louder and more invasive with every mile. He felt its presence in his chest, a relentless pressure that refused to be ignored. The world around him seemed to shift and blur, the trees bending unnaturally as though they were bowing to some unseen force. Finally, he spotted a sign for a nearby town and turned off the highway. The town was small and unremarkable, its streets lined with faded storefronts and weathered houses. James parked in front of a diner, its neon sign flickering weakly. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling faintly. The diner was nearly empty, save for a waitress behind the counter and an older man sitting at a corner booth. The waitress glanced up as James entered, her expression unreadable. He slid into a booth near the window, his eyes scanning the room as he tried to steady his breathing. The older man's gaze lingered on him, and James felt a chill run down his spine. There was something off about the man, something that set him apart from the ordinary surroundings. Finally, the man rose and approached James' booth, a slight limp in his step. "You're not from around here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. James hesitated, unsure how to respond. "No," he said finally, "just passing through, The man nodded, his piercing blue eyes studying James intently. "You've seen it, haven't you?" James' heart skipped a beat. "Seen what?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The man slid into the booth across from him. "The Watcher," he said simply. "It's marked you. I can feel it." James leaned back, his pulse racing. "Who are you?" The man's expression darkened. "Someone who's been where you are now. Someone who survived. But if you don't act quickly, survival won't be an option." James' hands clenched into fists. "How do I stop it?" The man glanced around the diner, as if ensuring they weren't being overheard. "There's a place," he said. "A sanctuary. People there know how to deal with things like this. They've been fighting the dark for generations. I can take you there, but it's not without risk." James nodded, desperation overriding his fear. "Let's go." The journey to the sanctuary was harrowing. The man, who introduced himself only as Elias, drove through the night, navigating twisting back roads and overgrown trails. The hum followed them, growing louder as they approached their destination. James could feel the Watcher's presence, a cold weight pressing down on him like a shroud. Finally, they arrived at a secluded estate, its gates adorned with symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The air felt different here, charged with an energy that was both unsettling and reassuring. Elias parked the car and they stepped out, the sound of the Watcher's hum fading slightly as they crossed the threshold. Inside, the sanctuary was a maze of corridors and rooms, its walls lined with books, artifacts, and tools James couldn't begin to identify. They were met by a group of people, each bearing the weary but determined look of those who had faced the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. A woman with silver hair and sharp eyes stepped forward, her presence commanding. "You've brought trouble," she said, her gaze fixed on James. Elias nodded. "He's marked by the Watcher. We need to act quickly." The woman studied James for a moment before gesturing for him to follow. "Come, there's much to explain and little time." Over the next several hours, James learned the truth about the Watcher. It was an ancient being, older than humanity, bound to the earth by rituals long forgotten. Its purpose was unknowable, its power immense. The sanctuary's inhabitants had dedicated their lives to containing such entities, but the Watcher's awakening was unprecedented. "You've become its tether," the woman explained. "It's using you to anchor itself to this world. If we sever that connection, we might be able to banish it back to where it came from." James swallowed hard. "And if you can't?" The woman's expression darkened. "Then the world will never be the same." The ritual to sever the tether was dangerous, requiring James to confront the Watcher directly. The sanctuary's inhabitants prepared for hours, drawing intricate symbols and chanting ancient incantations. James stood at the center of it all, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him like a physical force. When the time came, James was led to a circular chamber, its walls lined with glowing rooms. The air was thick with energy and the hum returned, louder than ever. As the ritual began, the Watcher's presence filled the room, its tendrils of shadow writhing and lashing out. James felt its cold, invasive force pressing against his mind, but he stood firm, focusing on the chants of the sanctuary's inhabitants. The battle was fierce, a clash of wills that left James teetering on the edge of collapse. But as the ritual reached its climax, the Watcher let out a deafening roar, its tendrils retreating as the runes flared brightly. With a final, blinding burst of light, the hum ceased and the room fell silent. James collapsed to his knees, his body trembling. The Watcher was gone, banished back to wherever it had come from. But the cost of the victory was etched into his soul, a weight he would carry forever. As the sanctuary's inhabitants helped him to his feet, James knew his life would never return to normal. He had faced the darkness and survived, but the scars of that encounter would remain. And in the quiet corners of his mind, he knew the Watcher was not truly gone. It was merely waiting, biding its time until the world once again dared to disturb its slumber. The world outside the sanctuary was eerily quiet when James finally emerged. The air felt different, lighter, as if the act of banishing the Watcher had lifted a great weight from the earth. Yet, as he stepped into the crisp morning light, James felt no relief, only an overwhelming exhaustion that seeped into his very bones. The events of the past few days felt surreal, a fevered dream that had somehow etched itself into reality. Elias stood beside him, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's over," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. James shook his head. "Is it?" he asked, his tone laced with doubt. He could still feel it. A faint echo of the Watcher's presence, a shadow in the corners of his mind. The ritual had severed the connection, but the memory of that immense, incomprehensible force was something he would carry forever. The silver-haired woman, who James now knew as Claire, joined them. "For now it's contained," she said. "But beings like the Watcher don't simply disappear. They're part of the fabric of existence. The best we can do is ensure they remain dormant." James turned to her, his expression weary but resolute. "And if it wakes again," Claire's sharp eyes softened slightly, "then we'll be ready. That's why we exist, to protect the world from what it isn't ready to face." Elias clapped James on the shoulder. "You've done your part, kid. You can go back to your life now." James let out a bitter laugh. "Go back to my life," he repeated. "After everything that's happened? After everything I've seen?" He gestured vaguely toward the sanctuary. "There's no going back. Not after this." Claire nodded solemnly. "You're right. This experience has changed you. It's not something you can forget or ignore. But that doesn't mean you can't move forward." James was silent for a moment, staring at the ground. "What if I don't want to move forward?" he asked quietly. "What if I want to help, to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" Elias and Claire exchanged a glance. Claire spoke first. "It's not an easy path," she warned. "What we do is dangerous, and it demands everything you have. You'll be walking into the shadows willingly, knowing that most people will never understand or appreciate what you're doing." James met her gaze, his own filled with a newfound determination. "I've already been in the shadows," he said. "I'm not afraid of them anymore." The next few weeks were a blur of training and preparation. James stayed at the sanctuary, learning everything he could about the Watcher and the other entities like it that lurked in the forgotten corners of the world. The sanctuary's inhabitants were a diverse group, each with their own skills and specialties. There was Marcus, an expert in ancient languages who could decipher runes and texts that seemed incomprehensible to others. Sophia, a tracker who could sense the presence of entities from miles away. And Claire, the leader, whose knowledge of rituals and containment methods was unparalleled. James threw himself into the training, determined to make himself useful. He studied the symbols and incantations used in the ritual that had banished the Watcher, learning their meanings and applications. He practiced combat techniques with Elias, who proved to be a surprisingly skilled fighter despite his age. And he spent hours in the sanctuary's library, poring over texts that detailed encounters with otherworldly forces throughout history. Despite the grueling pace, James found a strange sense of purpose in his new life. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself, something that mattered. The nightmares still came, vivid and horrifying, but they no longer paralyzed him. Instead, they fueled his resolve to protect others from the horrors he had faced. One night, as James sat alone in the library, Claire joined him. She placed a thick, leather-bound book on the table and opened it to a page filled with intricate diagrams and symbols. "This is what we're up against," she said, pointing to an illustration of a massive, tentacled creature surrounded by swirling darkness. "The Watcher is just one of many. They're called the Elders, ancient beings that existed long before humanity. Most of them are dormant, bound by rituals or natural barriers. But if even one of them wakes fully," James nodded, his jaw set, "then we're all in trouble." Claire studied him for a moment before closing the book. "You're learning fast," she said, "but knowledge alone won't be enough. You need to trust your instincts in this line of work. Hesitation can be deadly. James met her gaze. "I won't hesitate," he said firmly. Months passed, and James became an integral part of the sanctuary's team. He joined them on missions to investigate disturbances and reinforce containment measures. Each encounter was a reminder of the fragility of the balance they were trying to maintain, and of the stakes they faced if they failed. One mission took James and Elias to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of a city, where reports of strange lights and disembodied voices had surfaced. The factory was a labyrinth of rusted machinery and crumbling walls, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. As they delved deeper, the hum returned, faint but unmistakable. James felt his pulse quicken as they approached the source of the disturbance. In the center of the factory floor stood a makeshift altar, its surface covered in symbols drawn in blood. Atop the altar was a shard of black glass, its surface swirling with a faint, otherworldly light. "Another tether," Elias muttered, his expression grim. James nodded, his grip tightening on the containment device they had brought. They worked quickly, surrounding the altar with protective runes and activating the device. The air grew heavy as the shard's light flared, but the runes held, and the shard's energy was safely contained. As they left the factory, James felt a sense of accomplishment tempered by the knowledge that their work was far from over. The Watcher might have been banished, but its influence lingered, and the threats it represented were all too real. 1 year after the events at Ravenwood Lodge, James returned to the site. The lodge was gone, its ruins overgrown with moss and vines. The land was quiet, the air still. James stood at the edge of the clearing, his thoughts a mix of reflection and resolve. He wasn't the same person who had stumbled into the lodge that fateful night. He was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect the world from the forces that lurked in the shadows. The Watcher had marked him, but he had turned that mark into a purpose. As he turned to leave, James felt a faint vibration beneath his feet. He paused, his gaze narrowing. The hum was gone, but its memory lingered, a reminder that the darkness was always waiting. But this time, James was ready, and he would never stop fighting.